So hello, everybody. Welcome to Circling into Dialogos and my very first reading and riffing on Heidegger's basic questions of philosophy. So as some of you know, I've been reading the text of Almas, reading it and talking about it and riffing on it and trying to figure out what Almas is getting at. And I thought it would be I had such a good time doing that, and I'd been wanting to read this text for a while. Well, I've read the text myself. In fact, this is one of my favorite texts of Heidegger. But I've had mixed feelings about doing that on YouTube because I'm not sure. Well, it's Heidegger. I mean, what else can you say? But this particular text, I think I like because, well, one, it's a text that many people say demarcates a transition in Heidegger out of, you could say, the early work of like being in time into what many people refer to as the Heideggerian turn, where in early Heidegger, the conversation is more about trying to elucidate the question or the meaning of being through a deep ontological interpretation of ourselves, right? Of Dasein, of human being. Later Heidegger, for a lot of different reasons, shifts into wanting to address being from being itself and get at being that way. And I think this is one of the first texts that he published or that he made publishable that in the first, perhaps the first lecture course in which he started to open into this inquiry about history, right? About the way that being has epochs of history, right? And that part of its meaning unfolds through a kind of history. Now, what Heidegger means by history is really difficult to discern for me. And I think it's notoriously known to be one of the more difficult things in Heidegger, right? Is this the way that he understands history versus something that he calls historiography, I think, which is more of like, I think our standard understanding of history is like a linear sequence of historical events. History, in the way that Heidegger's going to be talking about, is something much deeper. But this text begins to grapple and introduce this notion. But it also is this, in my view, it's, and I don't know why this is, but it's one of his more readable texts. It's not at all easier. In fact, I think in some sense it's one of his most difficult texts. Yet there's a way that the text implicates the reader in a very profoundly direct way that, and in some sense, Heidegger is always doing that, right? He's always talking about the event of philosophy, right? And this notion of that to be philosophical is to be transformed by philosophy, right? This kind of confronting you, right, with the reality of your being, to ask the question of being, right? That you yourself are the being in whom your being is a question for you, right? So in some sense, there's not a whole lot of difference between the practice of philosophy and being a human being for Heidegger. And in this text, right off the get-go, gets at that. Now, I'm excited, and hopefully I'll be able to share through this fumble fucking through Heidegger's text and grappling with this, that hopefully I'll be able to share some of the profound experiences of reading Heidegger that have had a big influence on me. I think many people talk about reading Heidegger, and it's very much this. It's kind of like a lot of people talk about Heidegger like, yeah, life was one way, and then I read Being in Time, and then everything was different. I could never see anything the same, right? It's it's a strange thing, because in some sense, Heidegger's saying things, and he's got, kinds of views and understandings, and there's the content of what he's getting at. But there's a whole other level where what it takes to understand what he's getting at is itself part of the understanding, right? It's the process of understanding. And I remember when I was, younger, in my early 20s, in art school, right? A poor, artist, going to the art institute, and getting a whiff of Heidegger, and then going across the street at Barnes and Noble by the Fisherman's Wharf every day. And of course, no one bought the Heidegger book, so they basically were mine. And not knowing much about philosophy or Heidegger, like having reading disabilities and dyslexia and ADD and all kinds of like childhood trauma, and all that comes with that, something spoke to me in that text, Being in Time. And I would go there, and I'd start loading up on coffee, and I'd start reading it and reading it and reading it. For the longest time, I had no fucking idea what the hell he was talking about, nor why I was reading it. But something called to me, something gleamed out of that. And it took a long time for me to understand what kind of impact it was having on me. But I would say that what it took to kind of understand what I was reading would have me have to step so outside of my own frame of reference, right, to kind of pivot my foot like in some place I've never put it before, and then sort of look back at what he's saying from that angle, and then falling forward and stumbling on it. And maybe I understand it, maybe I don't. But doing that over and over and over and over and over and over again, what I started to see is that the way that the world showed up started to transform. It started to show itself more. And I would say mostly this sense for what this quality of being that glimmers out of the side, like the side of your field of vision. There's something gleaming that's withdrawing, right? The thing that's like least apparent is somehow most determinate, and having like a scent for that, having an ear for that, an attunement for that, right, really, I think, opened up in reading Heidegger for me, and then became, I think at some point, this is what I do all day, is like notice that thing that won't completely reveal itself, but it's constantly echoing, right? And the various ways that has shaped this one saying this word, addressing you in the video. So hopefully, right, it would be great if in reading and grappling Heidegger, that in some sense, some of that opened up for a listener or two. I would recommend it. Okay, so let's start reading the text. Oh, and by the way, so I think it goes without saying, but I am not a Heideggerian scholar. I am not an expert on it. Like, cite me for your papers at the university at your own risk. If you get done watching these videos and your Dasein walks with a limp, it's not my fault. Don't blame me. blame YouTube. But there is a sense with this that you want to really, 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 really engage with the text. You really want to wrestle with it. It's in the wrestling with it that really matters. And it's not like you're going to walk away from this necessarily being able to feel like you have some secured knowledge of what Heidegger is presenting. Not at all. You're probably going to walk away with this with more questions and more upset, but with your senses so much more open, right? In fact, things that you thought that you knew and could easily describe with certainty, you may find undone, right? Hopefully. All right. with that, let's get started. Okay, chapter 1. Preliminary interpretation of the essence of philosophy. 1. Futural philosophy. Restraint as the basic disposition of the relation to being. Let me say that again. Futural philosophy. Restraint as the basic disposition of the relation to being, or Sein in German. Basic questions of philosophy. That seems to imply there is such a thing as philosophy in itself, from whose domain basic questions could be drawn out. But such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determines what philosophy is. But I'm going to read that again. But such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determine what philosophy is. Since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question, i.e., if we invest everything without exception, in this questioning, and do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question, i.e., if we invest everything without exception, in this questioning and do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths. Okay, so right here. So I want to start with the beginning here. So let's go line by line. So basic questions of philosophy. So right there, what a benign, informative, almost, simple description of a title. Basic questions of philosophy. Great. What are the basic questions of philosophy? That seems to imply, he goes on, that seems to imply there is such a thing as philosophy in itself, from whose domain basic questions could be drawn out. But such is not the case and cannot be. All right, so essentially he's saying that philosophy is, first of all, you could say that there's lots of ways that we could, in basic questions that we can have about phenomena in the world, about ourselves, about objects, about events, right? About all kinds of different things in the world. We can ask questions of it. And for most things, you ask questions about it, and you could say, as he puts it here, with your basic question, could be drawn out, right? You can look to that thing that's standing over there and then draw out the basic questions from it because it's existing on some level over there, that we can stand outside of it and ask questions of it. But there's a way in which it's already there. He's saying philosophy is not that kind of a thing. In fact, it's not a thing at all, right? It's not the kind of thing that's just simply there, and then you ask questions about it. Instead, but such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determine what philosophy is. Okay. So, in other words, he's starting to equate that it's not until you ask the basic question of philosophy that philosophy comes into being. So it's not first there's philosophy and then we ask questions about it, stand over against it and ask questions about it. No, philosophy does not come to being until we ask the basic question of philosophy. And so I think what he's kind of getting at here is that philosophy has something to do with if it's philosophy, right? It's constantly interrogating itself, right? In other words, philosophy is never settled once and for all, right? No, it stops being philosophy if that's the case. In fact, if we can look at it and then draw out questions of it, we may be asking questions about something, but it's not philosophy in the way that Heidegger is meaning it here. He's saying that no, that philosophy is the question of philosophy. And that when you ask and genuinely ask that question, right, is where philosophy begins and begins to show itself. So the question is first. Since, he goes on, since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question it. So, okay, right there. So one of the things about Heidegger is, the thing I've learned about Heidegger is that there's nothing just random or arbitrary when Heidegger writes. Every single word, right, has meaning, right? There's no art, like no kind of he just said that word and didn't really mean it, or he could have used other words. No, kind of every single thing. You kind of learn this about Heidegger. Every word is precisely put where it is for a particular reason or a multiple of reasons, right? So there's nothing kind of random about words. So one of the ways you want to look at Heidegger is just assume that every word that he uses with intention and with the purpose in mind, right? So he says, since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question it. Okay, so right there, he's talking about that philosophy is the kind of no thing, right, that can reveal itself, right? Think about that. That the being of philosophy is the kind of being, right, that will reveal itself through our questioning. And it's interesting because in some sense, you could say that philosophy an analogy is very much like a person. John Russin and I discussed this, right? He used this analogy about philosophy in Sites of Exposure, where he talked about philosophy, and I think this is right on. He talked about philosophy is very synonymous with getting to know another person, right? That you don't stand back and just analyze a bunch of facts and accumulate a bunch of knowledge about a person. You don't just make a list of what they're wearing and the thoughts that they have and all this kind of stuff. And then once you kind of like get everything describable or everything that they've ever said or something like that and get all the data on them, you can go, okay, that's you. No, like it's through getting to know them, you live through knowing them, right? And part of the way that you, especially in intimate relationships, in long, deep friendships, the very process of knowing them is synonymous with the process of being changed in, through, and knowing them, right? This knowing through being transformed in the knowing or the understanding. So philosophy in this sense has that kind of, that sense to it, right? To get to know philosophy, he's saying, is in some sense is to be changed by it. And then he really goes into this, is like, since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question it. And then he says, i.e., if we invest everything without exception in this questioning and do not merely act as if we were questioning, while still believing we possess our reputed truths, right? Okay, so he's like, so really, philosophy is the kind of thing that isn't there, then that you then ask questions about. It's in the asking the basic question of philosophy, right, that philosophy comes into being. And it comes into being, right, through your addressing and questioning it, right, and it comes to being, and then coming to know philosophy as it reveals itself will be the process of you being changed in understanding it. But there's a condition here. You have to invest everything. So what does he mean by everything? What does that mean, to invest everything without exception in this questioning, and do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths, right? So if we say, what isn't investing everything? Well, it's merely acting as if we're investing everything, but while still believing we possess our reputed truths. Okay, so if we just act as if we're really questioning, but instead, but really what's going on is we're clutching onto beliefs about what we already think is true, what we already understand, are always already given beliefs about reality. That if we do that, right, that isn't investing everything. But if we look at what that is, right, our reputed truths, right, our certainties, you could say, in many senses, you could say our beliefs in some sense, and I think in the way that he's referring to it, are not those things that we see. Our reputed truths are not those things that we see, but rather we see with. They're those things through which we see, but we do not see. And that through which that we see but do not see is what is what in some sense grant how the world and being as such discloses itself to us, right? So he's saying, like, don't hold on to that stuff. Invest everything, because everything's at stake in that investment. Why? Because philosophy operates at that level in which it's addressing, you could say, it's addressing that by means of which everything is available to us. So what is it, if you think about this, if you invest everything, like what's everything? Well, it's all things. It's the world. It's the inside and the outside. It's the up and the down. It's like everything. Well, what is it that mediates and allows everything to show up for us, right? He's saying, if you hold on to your reputed truths, right, everything is at stake for you. If you let those go, right, we can begin to perhaps see that for which we see with, and that becomes seen. And then when we start to see deeper, right, that seeing deeper will transform everything that we see. I don't know if I said that completely the way I would want to, but apparently that's the way I said it. So right off the bat, this very first paragraph, right, everything's at stake, right? We're in a whole world of like that isn't ready-made, that we just then show up and kind of curiously ask questions about. We have to give up everything and put everything at stake and ask the basic questions such that it will reveal itself through our questioning, but that revealing we will come to see through the process of being transformed through that reveal. Right there. Okay, let's go to the second paragraph. Heidegger goes on, the task of this brief preliminary interpretation of the essence of philosophy will simply be to attune our questioning attitude to the right basic disposition, or, to put it more prudently, to allow this basic disposition a first resonance. I'll go ahead and just read the whole paragraph, and then we can come back to sentence by sentence. But then, philosophy, the most rigorous work of abstract thought and disposition, I don't think I read that right, But then philosophy, the most rigorous work of abstraction, of abstract thought and disposition. Can these two really go together? Philosophy and disposition? To be sure, for precisely when and because philosophy is the most rigorous thinking in the purest dispassion, it originates from and remains within a very high disposition. Pure dispassion is not nothing, certainly not the absence of disposition, and not the sheer coldness of the stark concept. On the contrary, the pure dispassion of thought is at bottom only the most rigorous maintenance of the highest disposition, the one open to the uniquely uncanny fact that there are beings rather than not. Okay, so let's see if we can get at this here. So the task of this brief preliminary interpretation of the essence of philosophy will simply be to attune our questioning attitude to the right basic disposition. Okay, to attune, right? If you think about attunement, when you tune an instrument, you open your ear, right, and participate, right, with the vibration of the sound. And in feeling the sound, listening to the sound, the listening is seeking to, in some sense, conform with the sound in some sense, right? It's got more of this embodied sense to it, right? It's this to attune our questioning attitude. So in other words, that there's something that we bring to bear to this conversation, to philosophy. And the way of philosophy will simply be to attune our questioning attitude, right? So the attitude we bring to bear, right, to attune that questioning attitude to the right basic disposition. To put it more prudently, to allow this basic disposition a first resonance. So in other words, a disposition, okay, when I sense a disposition, like to be in a position is to be in a body. To be in a body is to be participating in a world. It's to be involved, participatory, attuned, you're listening, right? You're at effect and affecting, right? You're zeroing in a felt, embodied way, to be in a disposition, right? And so what he's saying is that if you attune your questioning attitude to the right basic disposition, or to put it more prudently, to allow this basic disposition a first resonance, right? So in other words, it's like we are taking our being, right? And in some sense, like a pitchfork, right? Or a tuning fork, where in some sense, I don't know if this is right, but where we're hitting, I don't know, we're hitting the note of being as such, right? And in attuning our very being, our embodied disposition, right? To be addressed by and address being, and allow it to, in some sense, inform, affect our basic disposition, right? So I think he's emphasizing this deep participation is what's called for to address the essence of philosophy, or let it address you. He goes on, but then philosophy, the most rigorous work of abstract thought and disposition. So this is what most people think of when they think of philosophy. They think of kind of like not deeply involved, but a kind of dispassioned, right, abstraction away from life in some sense, away from eminence and involvement and embodiment. It's an abstraction away from that, right, into the ideal, a kind of pure realm, if you will, an objectivity, a dispassion, rather than a disposition. And so he's basically saying, but is the most rigorous work of extract and disposition? Can these two, and then here's the challenging question, can these two really go together, philosophy and disposition? Because they seem so opposed or opposite ends of the spectrum. And he says, to be sure, for precisely when and because philosophy is the most rigorous thinking in the purest dispassion, it originates from and remains within a very high disposition. Okay, so what he's saying is that dispassionate observation and abstraction that we traditionally think of philosophical thinking, if you will, in some sense arises from the highest disposition in some way. What is he meaning here? That philosophy is the most rigorous thinking in the purest dispassion, right? Which dispassion, meaning in some sense a removal away from embodied disposition, embeddedness, attunement, those kinds of things. However, that dispassion originates from and remains within a very high disposition. So he's saying that the highest disposition or the high disposition, right, is where the purity of abstract thinking arises from and is maintained out of, I think is what he's saying. He goes on, the pure dispassion is not nothing, certainly not the absence of disposition, and not the sheer coldness of the stark concept. On the contrary, the pure dispassion of thought is at bottom only the most rigorous maintenance of the highest disposition, the one open to the uniquely uncanny fact that there are beings rather than not. So I think what he's basically saying is essentially like, although we may be thinking at high levels of abstraction, we're implicated fully in our being in doing so. In fact, doing so is perhaps the highest disposition that one can take, but it's a disposition that affords ourselves to be struck by the uncanny fact that there are beings rather than not. So it's so interesting. So right there, this, to really get that there are beings rather than not. In some sense, it's strange because, of course, there are beings, right? You live based on that fact. What could be more normal in an ordinary perception and understanding that, yeah, everything that we experience, everything that I am, everything that I've ever experienced, and I'm going to experience, you, me, up, down, the sky, inside, outside, all of it, all of those things they're there. They are. And if they are, they're not. They're not, right? But what he's saying is that that's actually uncanny. That's strange, right? That in other words, in order to be touched by the strangeness that there is being, right? To be shaken down to your bone marrow, this uncanny, sheer fucking wonder that there is anything at all and rather not nothing. that fundamental mystery that we normally just take for granted and live as if it's the case without ever really being affected down to our most basic disposition, right? And that very disposition, right, being in that disposition affords us to be open to be struck by the most familiar, being the most uncanny. That's what it is to engage in philosophy. Okay. So we got through the first two paragraphs. I think this is a good start. Thank you so much.